So my next question that I got asked about was about my experience with pen machines. That's a large question because that goes all the way back to really my experience with rotaries in general versus coils, because I started tattooing in 2001. And at that point, I mean, there were rotaries around. I think Spalding and Rogers had two. It was very little, and no one serious used those. It was only people used coils and that was it. It wasn't until Oklahoma that I actually started using rotaries. So it would have been after 2006 when Chris Trevino had an interview in Tattoo Artist magazine. He talked about using a swash drive rotary. I feel like that was the acceptance point for a lot of people where they thought of a rotary machine as being a viable machine. My concern was always having something that had a form factor that I could recognize. I went to a convention in Dallas that was called the Masters of Tattooing Convention. I met Mike Cruz, Shag Built, there, and I see his whole row of all of his machines on his table, and in the middle of that is this little machine that I can tell is a rotary, but it looks like a regular tattoo machine. It had a frame that resembled a standard tattoo machine, but instead of having coils, it had the little motor going sideways. It had an armature bar with a little cam with a swing arm that was pulling it up and down. I ordered one of those from him. I had one of the very first ones he ever made, and I used that for a bit. That thing was crazy heavy. It's really funny because it had a frame on each side of the tattoo machine. My intention with that machine was that I was going to mostly use that for large scale, large mags and stuff like that, because no matter what, rotary goes all the way up, all the way down, no matter what resistance you're placing against it. I found actually that was one of the worst things that machine was for, because of the fact that kind of the force profile of a rotary stroke changes. There's not a lot, at least with those early rotaries like that, there wasn't a lot of force on the bottom end of the stroke, so it had trouble penetrating on the front end. So using larger mags, it really wasn't great for. Using smaller to medium mags though, oh my god, it was fantastic. And I've kind of never looked back with rotaries ever since I used that. Doing these kind of large flat fields of work, having a flatter look like you end up having in most traditional, having something that's not responding by backing off is working in your best interest. In addition to that, if you're working with a small enough needle group where you're not dealing with a ton of surface resistance, then you're really not, the client isn't perceiving as much pain on the front end by not having that kind of slap sort of profile, and having more of an even up and down profile that then whenever it provides resistance will still go all the way up and all the way down, which is what, essentially the main difference between a rotary. It's going to go like this, and then as you provide resistance, it's still going to go all the way up, all the way down. Whereas a coil machine is actually more like a slap, but when you provide resistance, then it's doing less and less and less of the stroke. It's backing off. So for the longest time, I used rotaries for all of my coloring, for the most part, coloring, shading, things along those lines, and then used a coil for my lining. So I went from that original Shag Built to one of his canister rotaries. I used the original Old English that he made, and also used a Roy Richardson, which are all direct drive kind of style rotaries. With those, it's crazy amounts of torque and very little front end kind of feeling. I used those. I moved on to the D20, and the D20 was what I used for a really long time as my main coloring, shading machine. And then I used the direct drives from Spectra. That was my first kind of jump into more of a production style machine when it came to rotaries, because I liked the idea that you had this little back end thing that you could just easily change the stroke out. So I used those and then ended up moving on to a Cheyenne Hawk pen. And that was my first kind of use of like a pen form factor, which I really liked that a lot. It's funny that there's so much struggle early on in tattooing, just learning to use this device that had this awkward kind of weight resting above you. It's nice to not have that as a factor anymore, to have something that feels natural in the hand and just immediately to be able to focus on doing the important things, doing clean lines, tracing appropriately. You're able to get into learning higher level stuff quicker. When used to, it was just about using this device that was not really designed for the hand in any way whatsoever. But yeah, I used the Cheyenne Hawk pen was my very first pen machine. I liked that a lot. So before the Hawk pen, I was using a Sidewinder. I actually used the Sidewinder, the very first versions of them. I'm really big on trying new things when new things come about, because I always like to see if there's another tool that I can incorporate into kind of my repertoire, add more to the toolbox. I feel like even if I don't end up sticking with something, it makes me better at what I'm already using. Over the years too, I found that when I've gone back and forth between using rotaries and using coils, my experience with rotaries made me better at using coils, and my experience with coils then made me better at using rotaries. So I definitely recommend anyone that kind of sticks to one that they incorporate both into their process at some time or another, because it really will make you rethink the way that you're tattooing and the way your hand motions and things like that. You come back to the tool that you were using prior, and suddenly you experience it in a brand new way, and you're actually usually using it better. I went from the Cheyenne Hawk pen, I went from that to the Sidewinder and DMC machines from Dan Cuban. And the DMC, to this day, kind of as far as like machines with a cord, is my all-time favorite machine that I've used. Like, I feel like it was usable for everything, and I don't really know why he doesn't make those anymore, because they were amazing. I used them literally from everything from 3-liners all the way up to 14 rounds, and everything from 7 mags up to 23 mags, both needles on bars and cartridges for all of those. Like, it seriously was the all-arounder for machines. Whenever 2020 came around and the two major pen companies ended up releasing their battery machines, I first started with the Spectra, the FK Irons one, and that was great. Like, I liked it. And then I used the Cheyenne Solnova Unlimited 4.0, and that has a responsive mode, and that was kind of the final link that made lining with a rotary, or anything that wasn't like a Sidewinder essentially, a lot more viable. Because what that machine does in responsive mode is when it hits areas where it's getting more surface tension, it actually slows down, which doesn't make it hit softer, it actually makes it penetrate better. So a lot of these very awkward things about lining with the rotary, where you're always kind of having to point in the direction of the line that you're going, you didn't have to do as exact anymore. It could accommodate for kind of differences in the way that you were working. It made it feel a lot more natural. I line with the Cheyenne in responsive mode because of that, and then I do all of my shading and coloring in standard mode with the Cheyenne. I find with rotaries, when I'm talking with people who don't have really much experience with it, they always talk about lining with it being the awkward point for them. The main thing being, if you're coming from the world of coils, when you turn the power up, it's like making the force that's coming out of the coil much higher because it's dealing with magnetism, but it's only making it go a little bit faster. Whereas with rotaries, it's inverted. When you turn the power up, you're making it go a lot faster, but only a little bit more force. The big thing with rotaries to know is The longer of a stroke length, the more force you're going to get from the machine at all speeds. So you have to have a longer stroke length to line with, which again is the opposite of what the rule of thumb usually is with coils, where people will normally go for shorter stroke lengths to line with. My ideal these days is a 5mm stroke. When you're lining with a rotary, the last thing you want to do is to turn the power up. You want to get it to about the same power level that you would do your shading with and your coloring with, and attempt to line it with that. And if you're not getting solid lines from that, you want to increase your throw. So you want to stick your needle out a little bit farther. And once you've kind of got that where you can pull a solid line, then you can very slowly kind of turn up the power a little bit to where your hand speed feels natural and you're penetrating the skin properly so that you're getting a solid line. But the amount of throw that you have going out is the first place that you want to go, which is why those with rotaries, they normally have a very adjustable little turning grip on the pen machines. Is you tend to make a lot more like little micro adjustments to the throw than you ever would with a coil. And again, if you have any kind of machine that has like a quote-unquote responsive mode, or what they'll call like a back off, or something along those lines, you would utilize that, because that's going to slow the machine down when it runs into more surface tension, which again will make it penetrate better because it makes it less like a single solid piece of force and more like individual strikes. Oh, another thing with rotary machines, the issue that a lot of people have with lining with them, at least with pens, is that all pens tend to be pretty light. What's nice is that a lot of these companies now are starting to sell like stainless steel grips as additions to their machines. Like Cheyenne put out one, and it really makes a huge difference as far as the weight, like having that kind of weight in your hand to increase the amount of stability that you kind of feel from the machine. And it kind of also works to kind of sink the machine down as you pull lines. Lately my go-to pretty much is the Cheyenne 5.0. I've been happy with that for pretty much everything. It feels like a rotary with a good amount of tactile feedback on the bottom end of the stroke. Since it has that longer stroke, it has more force. And it doesn't seem so forceful that even with a 5 or a 7 mag, like I don't feel like I'm really doing a lot of, like I'm tearing up the skin or anything like that. I run my stuff pretty slow. I have it somewhere between, in Cheyenne terms, it's like when it's like 90 degrees, like the 3 o'clock position up to the 2 o'clock position, somewhere in there. If you use Cheyenne machines, that those Solnova machines, that'll make sense. I also have started using sidewinders again, since Dan has started making them with an RCA jack and a battery, and it's in a really nice balanced position. It feels very, very, very comfortable in the hand, and it's a very natural kind of thing to line with. I'm really happy with those. And then I started using Joshua Bauer's machines as well, because he also has set them up with an RCA jack that has an upward facing battery position. Again, getting those where they feel really comfortable and nice in the hand, and I've been enjoying that. The SC bobber from him, which I made a video about, and then I have the steel driver coming, my coworker Squire. I've used his steel driver quite a bit, and that actually resembles the Dan Cuban DMC probably closer than any other machine that I've used. It has this neat little mechanism where the cam pulls it down and it has a little rubber band, so it actually pulls it down with like a little bit more dynamic force on the front end, so it actually has like a little bit of a hit. So even at slower things, when it's not necessarily slowing down the way that responsive mode machines do, you're still getting like a really nice kind of penetrative sort of effect on it that feels like lining with a coil, close to it, but you don't have the back off of the coil. It's kind of the best of both worlds between rotaries and coils. So I hope all that made sense. I hope that helped. Since I moved on from cords and started using machines with batteries, it's really, really hard to go back from that. I do have a little device. I had a cord that would connect directly to a battery, and now I have a little device that adapts a battery to accept a cord if needs be. And I'll get those into a position, but man, having the option to kind of go anywhere within a tattoo and kind of run my arm over a person if needs be. It's a lot of little things that I kind of take for granted until I go back to using a cord, and then I'm like, oh, it's so much better without it. It's kind of everything that I always dreamed that things would be whenever I first started tattooing, 22 years ago. Like, man, it would be so nice if you just had one of these things and it just had nothing that it was attached to, because this thing kind of whipping around and getting in the way, and it's just always awkward, and it's just a more comfortable thing. So I'm really happy with everything that I'm using now. As far as batteries go, I've been using Critical batteries. I've heard good stuff about Muso Toku, and I've used their standard power supply before, and it was great. So I might try one of those in the future as well. But for now, I have one Critical battery and one Critical mini battery, and both of those are great. They're awesome. The mini I wish had a little longer power than it has. I find like I get about 1.5 to 2 hours max. Contemplation.